Calf in the Cottage by Lucy Daniels. Chapter 1. Mandy Hope tossed her blonde hair out of her eyes. There was a strong breeze blowing across the valley, and cycling uphill was hard work. "Come on, James, let's take the shortcut." "It's not a shortcut, not with all those hilly bits. That would just be hard work." "Well, what do you call this then?" Mandy asked with a grin. "Relaxation?" James Hunter was Mandy's best friend. Both he and Mandy were mad about animals and spent a lot of their spare time looking after them. Mandy's parents were vets. They ran Animal Ark, the veterinary practice in Welford. They'd adopted Mandy as a baby after her own parents had been killed in a car crash, and Mandy thought they were the best parents anyone could wish for. "Anyway, James," Mandy continued, "you're wrong. I tell you what, though, if we take the shortcut and you think I'm right, I'll let you look after my rabbits for a week." "Thanks, Mandy. And if I'm right, I'll let you look after them for a fortnight." Mandy grinned over her shoulder at James and pulled ahead of him. "Come on, James, race you to the beacon." The beacon was a Celtic cross and a landmark for miles around. Their friend Lydia Fawcett kept goats in a small holding nearby. Mandy smiled as she remembered one particular goat, Houdini, who was probably even better at escaping than his namesake. But today they were on their way to Barnall Mill, an old cotton mill on the other side of the valley. The Barnall Mill trustees were running a pet show to raise funds for the mill, and one or two of Mandy's friends were entering their pets. "Why didn't you enter Blackie for the pet show, James?" Mandy looked at her friend with a mischievous grin. James grinned back but didn't say a word. Blackie was his adorable black Labrador, very beautiful but not very obedient. He'd probably cause chaos at a pet show. They cycled on. Signs of spring were everywhere. Trees in bud, daffodils in the hedgerows, and best of all, lambs in the field. "Look, James, look at the lambs! Aren't they gorgeous?" Mandy and James stopped to watch them for a while, especially a little black one who thought he was cut out to be an explorer. They both laughed as he led his mother a merry dance round the field. "Reminds me of you and Blackie," said Mandy. "I don't think Blackie's quite as well trained as that lamb," said James, laughing. They picked up their bikes and pushed on. "Burnside Farm," said Mandy as they came to a wide 5-bar gate. "I haven't seen Mr. Matthews for ages." Mr. Matthews ran a small dairy farm, and Mandy loved the big farmhouse kitchen with its open fire and flagstone floor, but not as much as she loved the cows and calves that were Mr. Matthews' pride and joy, and not as much as Mr. Matthews loved them. Mandy's parents always said they had never met a farmer who loved his animals as much as Mr. Matthews did. "He's on his own at the moment," said James. "I heard his son went off to Australia to sort out some important family business. He was only supposed to be gone for a month, but he's having big problems sorting things out. He's been gone for ages now." "How come you know all about it?" Mandy asked. "Walter Pickard was talking to my mum outside the Fox and Goose the other day." "Poor Mr. Matthews," said Mandy. "I wonder how he's getting on with the farm without his son. Can we pop in and see?" "Mandy," James groaned. "It's already 12 o'clock and we're supposed to be having a picnic before the pet show starts. We'll never get there on time. And I'm starving." "But just think about Mr. Matthews all by himself. And the animals, what about them?" "Mandy," James said patiently, as if Mandy were 6 years old, "Mr. Matthews has been running that farm since before our parents were born. He knows what he's doing." "Still, I think we should go and see him, just in case." "You know what the matter with you is, don't you?" James didn't wait for a reply. "You haven't got any animal problems to sort out. No puppies in the pantry, no kittens in the kitchen, no badger in the basement." "Look who's talking, James Hunter." "I am," said James, grinning. "All right, let's go and see Mr. Matthews." They couldn't find Mr. Matthews in the yard or outbuildings, so they wandered over to Burnside Farm. It was a lovely old house built of grey Yorkshire stone. Tubs of daffodils stood either side of the big wooden door. James lifted the iron knocker and knocked loudly. They heard the sound of Westy, Mr. Matthews' West Highland Terrier, as he came scrambling and barking to the door. and Mandy saw Moggy, one of the farm cats, come running across the yard towards them. "Hi, Moggy! Hi, Beauty!" Moggy had long, fluffy black fur, and Mandy enjoyed the silky feel of it as she bent down to stroke the little cat. She put her hands behind Moggy's ears to give them a rub. "James, her fur's all tangled and knotted. She's not been brushed for ages." Mandy looked up at James, her eyes full of concern. She knew that Mr. Matthews adored his animals and made a good job of looking after them. "Well, Westy sounds his usual healthy self," said James. Mandy frowned as she continued to work her hands over the cat's coat. Mr. Matthews was a long time coming, but at last they heard his voice. "Quiet now, Westy, quiet boy." Moggy shot in through the door the minute it was opened, and Westy shot out. He barked up at Mandy and James and did a little dance at their feet. His short tail wagged furiously, and his little white body seemed to wag with it. "Hello, Mr. Matthews," said Mandy. "We were just cycling past on our way to Barnall Mill, and we thought we'd pop in and see you." "Well, that's very kind of you. You better come along in." They followed Mr. Matthews into the big farm kitchen. Westy was still doing a funny sort of dance, running backwards and forwards between his owner and the two friends. Mandy looked round the kitchen. It looked as though nothing had been cleared away for a week. The sink was piled high with dirty pots, and the table was covered in what looked like the remains of several meals. Absent-mindedly, Mandy picked up a jam jar and screwed the lid back on. Mr. Matthews noticed her doing it. "Aye, well, I've not been feeling up to much just lately. Just ignore the mess and sit yourselves down. I'll put the kettle on." "No, let me," Mandy offered. "You look as though you could do with a sit-down." "I'm not so old that I can't make a cup of tea for two honoured guests." Mr. Matthews smiled, and Mandy saw the familiar twinkle in his eye. Even so, she was concerned at how pale and tired the man looked, and at the mess in the kitchen. Whenever Mandy had come with her parents on routine checks of the animals, the kitchen had always looked spotless. Perhaps Mr. Matthews just couldn't cope at the moment. Mandy went to sit beside James on the old comfy sofa in front of the fire. She saw that there were ashes in the hearth and the fire was almost out. "Can I make up the fire for you, Mr. Matthews?" "No, thank you. I have to be out on the farm this afternoon. I was just having a lunchtime warm." Mandy sat back next to James. Westy sat on his knee and gazed up at him adoringly. Mandy laughed. "He's my #1 fan," said James, stroking the dog gently. "Aren't you, Westy?" Westy continued to gaze. His little tail flickered. "He can smell Blackie, that's why," Mandy replied. "He thinks you're a strange-looking dog." Mr. Matthews brought over 2 steaming mugs of tea. At the same time, Moggy decided to jump onto Mandy's knee, just nudging the man's hand as he lowered the mug towards her. The mug seemed to do a backwards flip, and in the next instant, Mr. Matthews' hand and arm were drenched in scalding tea. "Are you all right?" Mandy and James said at the same time. They both jumped up. James bent to pick up the fallen mug and went to find something to clear up the mess. Westy ran round Mr. Matthews' feet, clearly upset at all the commotion. "No need to fuss, no need to fuss. I'm perfectly all right." But Mandy could see that he wasn't. Mr. Matthews' arm was scarlet below the rolled-up sleeve, and he was shaking from the shock. "Let's get that arm under the tap," Mandy said, trying to take control of the situation calmly and quietly. There was hardly room for Mr. Matthews' arm with all the pots in the sink. James moved them away, and gradually Mandy saw that the cold water was beginning to take effect. Mr. Matthews seemed a bit less shaky. James found a towel and passed it to Mandy. "Thanks, James." Mandy patted the arm dry. She was as gentle as she could be, but even so she saw Mr. Matthews wince. "I think we should call the doctor." "There's no need for any fuss." "It's not fuss, Mr. Matthews. It's taking proper care." "I'm perfectly all right, Mandy. It's only a bit of hot water." They sat Mr. Matthews down on the sofa and began to clear away. Mandy tidied and sorted, and James washed the pots. In no time at all, the kitchen was looking clean and tidy, and James remembered that he was starving. "Have you had anything to eat, Mr. Matthews?" he asked. No, I'm not hungry." "You've got to eat something, Mr. Matthews. I'll go and get our picnic from the bike. You can share that." Mr. Matthews sighed and closed his eyes. "If you like," he murmured, almost to himself. Mandy followed James outside. "Will you sort the picnic out while I have a look at the animals?" she whispered. "I want to have a go at Moggy's coat, then check that the others have been fed." "Okay, Casualty Officer Hope, but get a move on, I'm starving." "So am I," called Mandy, almost back in the kitchen. "Have you got a brush for the cats, Mr. Matthews? I thought I'd give them a going over while I'm here." "In the boiler room." Mr. Matthews pointed with his good arm. "Through the door and first on your right." "And have you got any scissors?" "Scissors?" "Moggy's fur's a bit knotted. Some of it's quite bad. It won't brush out." Mandy felt herself blush. "Hanging on a nail in the boiler room." His voice was very quiet, and Mandy saw that he looked a bit shamefaced. "I've just not been feeling myself, you see. Couldn't get round to it somehow." Mandy wanted to put her arm around Mr. Matthews and give him a hug. It wasn't his fault if things were getting too much for him. Mandy found the brush and scissors easily enough. She also found Tabs, the old tabby cat, curled up on the boiler fast asleep. She gave her a scratch under the chin, and Tabs stretched herself luxuriously. "It's a hard life, isn't it, Tabs?" she said with a smile. She ran her hand over the cat's coat. But Tabs was short-haired and sleek and had managed to keep her own coat in good condition. "I'll leave you in peace then, old girl," said Mandy, giving Tabs a final pat. The animals' bowls were on the floor of the boiler room, encrusted with stale food. There was a big enamel sink, and she put the bowls in there to soak. She could wash them afterwards and feed the animals if necessary. Back in the kitchen, James was spreading out the picnic things on the table. It was a good job they'd packed plenty. There'd be quite enough for Mr. Matthews too. But first, Mandy wanted to sort Moggy's coat out. She lifted the sleeping cat onto her knee. "Come on, Moggy, let's make you beautiful again," she murmured gently. The cat enjoyed Mandy's attentions. The knots were removed with one or two deft snips of the scissors. Moggy began to purr as Mandy brushed her coat, rhythmically and gently. In no time at all, Moggy's coat was back to its former glory. Mandy was pleased with her efforts. "She looks a treat," said Mr. Matthews quietly. "A real treat. Oh, thank you." James had organised lunch, and Mr. Matthews joined them, although he didn't eat very much. Mandy noticed that his arm had begun to blister. "I still think you should go and see the doctor, Mr. Matthews." "Mandy," Mr. Matthews said firmly, "I've got more new calves to look after, and I know what to do with. I haven't got time to go to the doctor's." Mandy frowned. If he didn't go to the doctor's, then his arm might get worse, and he wouldn't be able to work. Then what would happen to the animals? She knew that they couldn't be neglected even for a day. "Have you got anyone who could help on the farm, Mr. Matthews?" James asked. "No, I'll manage by myself. Really, James, you're not to worry." "But what about the cows?" he persisted. "The cows will be fine," the old man said. "And if you stop plaguing me, I'll let you see the calves before you go." "Oh, please, Mr. Matthews," said Mandy. "Please, could we see them?" Westy, who'd been sitting under the table, waiting for Titbits, jumped up on Mandy's knee when he heard her excited voice. His tail wagged like a little flag. "We're going to see the calves," she told him, giving the dog a hug. "And we better get cracking if we're going to get to Barnell Mill on time." Westy jumped from her lap as she stood up. Together, she and James tidied away the picnic things and washed the few plates they'd used. Then Mandy went back to the boiler room to wash the animals' bowls. "Shall we feed the animals before we go?" Mandy called. "No, thank you." Mr. Matthews' voice was firm. "They're not due yet, and I can manage myself." Once outside, he'd led them across the yard to the wooden outbuildings. "Come and look at this little beauty," he said. "Smashing little heifer, 10 days old, born at 3 o'clock in the morning, so I was up half the night with her." Mr. Matthews laughed. He didn't look as though he minded. He pushed open the door to the calf box. "I've called her Maisie," he told the two friends. "You've never seen such a beauty." She was a beauty, a little brown and white animal with a soft pink nose. She ran jerkily round the calf box when the three of them entered, but she soon stood still when she saw that they were standing quietly. She came to sniff at Mandy's outstretched hand. Then her rough pink tongue came out and she tried to suck Mandy's fingers. "It feels lovely," said Mandy, laughing, even though her tongue's so rough. "I think I'd like a calf for a pet," said James, stroking the little animal's soft coat. "I think you've got your hands quite full enough with Blackie and Eric," said Mandy. Some time ago, she and James had found homes for a whole litter of unwanted kittens. Eric had been one of them, and he'd grown into a much-loved cat. "I don't think your parents would be too happy if you turned up with a calf," she added, "and I can't imagine a fully grown cow curled up in front of the sitting room fire." Everyone laughed. "Have you got any more cows due for calving?" Mandy asked. "I love looking at them. They look like big round barrels." "We better not be too long," warned James. "Otherwise we'll miss half the pet show." "Won't take a tick," said Mr. Matthews. "Come into the cubicle shed." Mandy and James followed Mr. Matthews round the back of the carving box and past the milking parlour, then into the enormous cubicle shed. It was almost as big and high as an aeroplane hangar. The cows turned to stare at them lazily. Mr. Matthews ran his hand over a big brown and white cow. Then he turned to Mandy and James with a worried look on his face. "She's started to calve already. She's having twins and she's not due for a good while yet." Mandy knew that even 10 days could mean the difference between a healthy calf and one that didn't survive. And it was even worse when the cow was expecting twins. Mandy's heart sank. It didn't sound too good at all.